Witkowski, and I am the Program Specialist for MDA's Innovation and Care team, and I'm honored to serve as your moderator for today's webinar. The webinar today is part of our larger MDA Engage flagship community event series, which began in 2018. The focus is on bringing the neuromuscular community together around education and social opportunities. So be sure to check out the MDA Engage events section on mda.org for updates on upcoming in-person as well as virtual events. Now I have just a few housekeeping items to go over before we begin. We are recording today's event and we'll be posting it to the mda.org website for an on-demand viewing down the road, and to ensure that those who weren't able to join us live today are able to access this information. For those of you joining the event live, please know that all phone lines have been muted. We will have a Q&A session following today's presenters, so please be sure to utilize the chat window to type in your questions. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, a tray of webinar icons will appear, and just click on the chat bubble to open that chat feature and enter your question to the host. Feel free to chat in questions as they come up during the presentation. Now, with that information taken care of, thank you again to everyone in the community who's joining live today or are viewing this on demand. And thank you to our guest presenters today, Dr. Rabia Malik and Richard Deneen, both from Rush University Medical Center in Chicago, Illinois. We sincerely appreciate your time, effort, and expertise in everything you do for our neuromuscular community. Also, thank you to our event sponsor, Sanofi Genzyme. We wouldn't be able to provide events like this if not for their generous support, so thank you very, very much. Now, the objectives of today's webinar will include the following: understanding the basics of genetics, learn about genetic testing, gain knowledge about Pompe disease and SMA as examples of genetic diseases, familiarize oneself with the process of genetic testing, and finally, we will hear from a personal family story. So now, I will turn the webinar over to Dr. Malik and Richard Deneen, who will give a brief self-introduction and begin the presentation.
Hello, everyone. This is Rabia Malik. I'm a neuromuscular physician here at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. I serve as the director of the MDA Care Center here at Rush. I'm very excited to be part of this webinar today. Hopefully by the end of this seminar, you'll learn that genetic testing is easy, it's critical for diagnosis, and early diagnosis will, in a number of cases, lead to better outcomes. I look forward to all of your questions.
And my name is Rich Deneen, and I'm a genetic counselor also at Rush University Medical Center. And I first became involved working in an MDA clinic when about 10 years ago a neuromuscular neurologist approached our genetics group and requested that a genetic counselor begin to work in a clinic. And I sort of used that experience during the past 10 years that genetic testing has really changed a lot. And so, hopefully be able to shed light on that through today's webinar.
I think we are ready to begin, so we can move on to the next slide here. I will start off by just discussing some basics of genetics. So we thought it was important before we would discuss any type of genetic testing to just go over some simple terms and phrases with regards to genetics in general. Next slide, please. So the first term that we'll talk about is a cell. So the cell is a structural and functional unit of all living organisms. The human body is made up of trillions of cells. Each cell, aside from a red blood cell, contains a nucleus. Next slide, next please. So that's demonstrated by the arrow. So you can kind of see that fried egg-looking structure. The colors are a little bit different from a regular fried egg, right? I mean, so the center or the core is actually white, and that's the nucleus of the cell. The nucleus functions as the control center of the cell and contains thread-like structures called chromosome. Next, please. Surrounding the nucleus is the cytoplasm. Next, please. Each chromosome is made up of long chains of DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It is the DNA within the chromosomes that holds all the genetic information. The total length of the DNA within each cell is over 6 feet, and in order to fit it within the cell's nucleus, it has to exist in a tightly packaged form. DNA is composed of bases, sugars, and phosphates that combine together to form a double helix, this twisted ladder structure that you're seeing on the screen. There are 4 different types of bases. You can see that at the bottom of the slide in the green, red, purple, and yellow. These 4 bases are adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. DNA bases pair up with each other to form the ladder rungs. These bases within the DNA form the code for the production of proteins. Next, please. Think of gene as sort of the basic unit of inheritance. The part of the DNA or the segment of the DNA that codes for one single protein forms a gene. Next, please. Proteins are made up of long chains of amino acids. Proteins are needed for all functions of a cell. In order to function, cells need information to produce proteins and the ability to pass this information onto new cells during cell division. This important information is provided by the DNA. Next, please. Let's talk a little bit about types of gene mutation. So as we learned in the prior slide, chromosomes are the genetic information that lies inside the core or the center of the cell. So think of chromosomes as like chapters in a book. One set is from the mother and one set is from the father. Genes are like sentences in a chapter. Mutations are like misspelled words or the disruption of a sentence. For example, here, instead of saying the car was red, there's a missing word and the sentence doesn't make sense. The was red. So that's what a mutation would look like. Next, please. There are 4 different types of mutations. The first one that we'll discuss is a missense mutation. This occurs when there's a change in one word or letter. So let's look at that example, the car was red. When you miss a word, the sentence doesn't make sense. The car was hat, for example. Similarly, if there is a letter that's put in incorrectly, a word won't make sense. Instead of red, you have RDD. Next, please. There's another type of mutation called nonsense mutation. This occurs when the instructions end too soon. So for the example that we're looking at, it would just say simply the car, period. Next, please. Insertion mutations, as the name implies, is the addition of one word or letter that's sort of extra. Next, please. Lastly, a deletion mutation changes the meaning by subtracting a single word or letters. Next, please. So inheritance, as we learned in the previous slides, the portion of the DNA that codes for one protein is called a gene. Genes are the basic unit of inheritance. Next, please. Genes occur in pairs on each chromosome in the same location and are termed alleles. Next, please. And one more click, please. Dominant allele, there are 2 kinds of alleles, dominant and recessive. Dominant allele is expressed regardless by any instructions carried by the other allele. Next, please. A recessive allele is not expressed due to the presence of a dominant partner allele and is only expressed when both alleles are in a recessive form. For example, the allele that codes for freckles is dominant over the allele for no freckles. Therefore, a person who carries two different alleles for this gene, an allele for freckles and an allele for no freckles, will have freckles on their skin. This is because the freckles gene is dominant and will be expressed in that individual. Next, please. All right, so that was some basics of genetics. I'm going to pass this webinar on to Rich Deneen, who will talk about genetic testing.
Thank you. So maybe we can go to the next slide, and hopefully the first part of the webinar was able to give people a basic foundation of genetics that will help us then to talk about genetic testing. So, well, what is genetic testing? According to the Centers for Disease Control, genetic testing looks for changes, often called mutations, or today we more often will use the term variants within your DNA. And depending upon the laboratory, there's actually not a single genetic test. There's many different types of genetic tests today. I'm just going to highlight two of the most common testing methods that we use today. If you kind of think back to the slide that Dr. Malik had used, talking about the DNA and that the DNA is made up of really essentially of just four different letters, A, T, C, and G. And so each gene is, made up of thousands of letters. So one testing method is something that we call sequencing, which we'll tell families is very often similar to like a spell check of the gene, looking for a single letter spelling mistake, possibly a single extra missing letter, things of that nature. But then the second testing method that's often used today to look at a gene is there's a separate testing method to look for large missing or extra pieces of genetic instructions within the gene. Now that being said, since we're speaking to the MDA community, there are going to be some groups within the community where those two different types of testing methods don't apply. Some of the ones that come to mind is myotonic dystrophy or FSHD, OPMD. Those would be sort of examples of conditions where we actually have to use, a specialized, specific testing method to look at, the gene in those particular instances. But if that was the case, the staff in your MDA clinic could discuss, what would be the most appropriate test in your circumstances. Next slide, please. But for those who maybe haven't been through the genetic testing process for some time, one of the take-home messages that I really want to send is that a lot has changed over the years. And so when I first started in an MDA clinic, we were only, in most instances, able to test for a single gene in the body at a time. And what was that like? Well, it was a very time-consuming process. We had to, test that particular gene, wait a period of time for results, and if that test didn't give us an answer, we'd have to move on to the next gene. And so sometimes that process would also be expensive. Through genetic technology, they've developed methods over the past decade that have allowed us to test for many genes all at the same time, something that we call a genetic testing panel. And, there's sort of two benefits of that. That technology allowed us to test for multiple genes at the same time, but it also made the cost drop significantly with doing genetic testing. So I often tell families it's the one area of medicine where the cost has actually dropped over time. The other thing that's important to know that changed is how we actually collect a sample has also changed. It was very common in the beginning when I started working in the clinic that a good majority of the individuals would have had a muscle biopsy as part of their diagnostic workup. That often, may not be necessary in some instances, and I think people think about genetic testing most often involving blood, but today there's easier collection methods where you can obtain by using saliva, cheek cells, and I do try to assure families that all of those testing methods are equally accurate. Each of those is essentially collecting some of the DNA, the genetic material for testing. If you're sort of wondering if you're somebody who's had genetic testing in the past and if you could benefit from more current testing, sort of encourage individuals to really speak to their MDA staff to determine whether they would maybe benefit from a more current method of testing. And some of those that would fit in that category would be, for example, somebody who didn't receive an answer before through genetic testing, or possibly just a partial answer. That might be someone who might benefit from some more current testing. Next slide. And so, a common question that I'll hear in clinic is, well, why should I consider genetic testing? I've had maybe sometimes my symptoms for many years. Why should I even be thinking about this? I think, as Dr. Malik pointed out earlier, the one thing it can do is it can potentially provide absolute certainty of a particular diagnosis. So if there's maybe been a question of one or several diagnoses, sometimes genetic testing can help. I think, as we'll also learn, many treatments and therapies are really now being developed based on a specific gene in the body or based on the specific kind of gene change that's present, whether it's a misspelling or a missing piece might guide the type of treatment that would be available. Another category, though, that I think is equally important is sometimes you actually have to have positive genetic test results to participate in a disease registry. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the webinar. And you also may often need to have positive genetic test results to be allowed to participate in a clinical trial. And so, basically the summary of this is that if you do get an answer from genetic testing, that information can really be used in a variety of different helpful ways. And so, sort of ending on that point, I'm going to turn things back over to Dr. Malik. Oh, next slide, please.
All right, thank you, Rich. So we thought it would be nice to talk about Pompe's disease and SMA as examples of genetic diseases where early testing and initiation of treatment can lead to better outcomes. So let's talk about Pompe's disease first. This disease was named after Dutch pathologist Dr. Johannes Pompe in 1932. It is a hereditary disease. It's rare. It affects 1 in 40,000 people. It's caused by mutation in the GAA gene, which causes a deficiency of a protein called acid maltase. Because of this deficiency, there is a buildup of a type of sugar called glycogen in the muscle. The picture on your right is basically a picture of a muscle biopsy from a patient with Pompe's disease. Normal muscle is pink, but the white circles or the holes that you see are basically droplets of extra sugar or glycogen in the muscles, which shouldn't be there. Next, please. This disease can present in infants, in children, and most commonly in adults. In adults, it leads to muscle weakness that progresses over time and leads to trouble with walking and climbing stairs. Patients may have breathing difficulties, and in a third of the cases, this may actually be the first presenting symptom. The heart is not typically involved in the adults, but is commonly involved in infants. Next, please. Infantile onset or disease that starts in infancy is fatal. Untreated adults develop progressive disability and breathing difficulties that requires the use of assisted ventilation like BiPAP machines and CPAP machines. Until recently, there was no treatment option for this condition. In 2006, the FDA approved a medication called Myozyme for Pompe's disease. In 2010, a second drug called Lumizyme became available. Both drugs substitute the enzyme missing in Pompe's disease. Data from clinical trials has shown that treatment with enzyme replacement therapy, particularly when initiated early before irreversible muscle damage sets in, extends survival and delays the need for invasive ventilation, improves cardiomyopathy, which is enlargement of the heart, and makes it possible for many infants and children with Pompe's disease to attain developmental milestones and level of function never before possible, including walking and running. So enzyme replacement therapy has shown major benefit, and early diagnosis with genetic testing and early initiation of treatment is critical to improving survival and reducing disability. Next, please. SMA, which stands for spinal muscular atrophy, is the leading genetic cause of infant death. It is characterized by progressive muscle weakness, just like Pompe's disease. It may also cause breathing difficulties. This disease is caused by mutation in the SMN1 gene. Some of the common SMA types are type 1, where the child never learns to sit, type 2, where the child never learns to stand, and type 3, where the child may be ambulatory or can walk, but then over time loses this vital function. Next, please. Was there a slide prior to this? Did we skip one slide? Okay, all right, thank you. Next slide, please. The FDA approved first treatment of SMA in 2016, and as recent as May of this year saw the FDA approval of a second gene therapy directed against SMA. Again, in large research studies, we saw that infants who received treatment were more likely to be free of mechanical ventilation, and these kids were able to achieve better motor milestones. So this disease is another example where rapid diagnosis and early treatment leads to better outcome. Next, please. Okay, and with that, we'll move on to the process of genetic testing.
Next slide, please. And so hopefully this next group of slides will help to demystify the process of actually of having genetic testing. One area that we'll talk about a little bit later as well is, obviously at a different, MDA clinic, neuromuscular clinic, there's a lot of different providers, but sometimes to really, point out that it's the neurologist that actually determines the appropriate category for genetic testing. So let's say, for example, in clinic, one of the neurologists might tell me as a genetic counselor that, that this individual might be a good candidate, say, for a limb-girdle muscular dystrophy panel. And so that helps to guide, what type of testing I need to talk about to the individual or family. Another point that I think will be important for people to know is that, you often today are not required to make a decision about testing at the clinic because there's, sometimes some other arrangements that need to be made, and there's ways to be able to collect a laboratory sample at a later date. Well, what would be some reasons for doing that? So, well, number one, you might want to be able to check on whether that patient's healthcare coverage is actually going to cover the genetic testing, whether you're needing to look into other options for that family. But also some laboratories, if there's difficulty, for example, getting healthcare coverage to recognize testing, in some instances they may have a lower cash price option available to the family as well. So really depending upon the family's finances, the particular type of testing that we're doing, there's often, a number of different options that we can be looking into after a clinic visit. After, basically doing some type of an investigation to see if testing would be covered, a sample is sent to a laboratory. And depending upon where, you receive your care, in most instances that laboratory is going to be located in a different state. Not always, but, that's often the case. Most genetic tests, depending on what's being performed, would take several weeks. And in some of the genetic tests that we'll talk about at the end might require several months to come back, depending on the type of testing. One thing I sort of stress with families is, don't be concerned, don't hesitate to bring up costs regarding, costs of testing with clinic staff. There are a number of different options today in which to try to make testing happen for somebody if they really desire testing. But we also don't want families to receive any unexpected bills or costs from testing. And again, there's ways to do that today so that somebody, doesn't get a surprise bill. Next slide. Another area that I think is, particularly important for someone who's considering genetic testing is the category of, what different types of test results might I expect? I think a lot of times people go into testing expecting more of a yes or no answer. This will tell me I have this condition or not. And while there's instances that that's the case, there's other possibilities as well. So some of the three general categories of genetic test results are, positive test results, which means that the genetic testing has identified an alteration in a gene, which is specific to a particular medical diagnosis. And today within genetic testing, sometimes that terminology is called pathogenic, where the gene change is known to result in a medical condition. Someone can receive negative results, which means, no alteration in that particular gene or sometimes group of genes was identified. And sometimes people are surprised by that because with some of the testing panels today, maybe we've tested somebody for 100 different genes, but yet the results come back to be completely negative. I really remind people that there's more than 22,000 genes in the body, so anytime you may have had a panel, that's still not looking at all the genes all at one time. The third category is I think the most important, because I try to prepare people for that, is that testing could sometimes identify a change where the significance of that change is unclear. So sometimes we'll call that a variant of uncertain significance. There are ways, if there's unclear results, sometimes to try to help clarify those results. So for example, sometimes maybe testing other family members, if there's other family members who have symptoms, or sometimes testing other family members who do not have symptoms can sometimes help us to clear up a result that's unclear. Next slide. Another common question I feel that comes up in clinic is, I've received a result from genetic testing. Well, now what? Now what do I do about that? Well, the first important part is actually to review the results with your treating neurologist. So now that a specific diagnosis has been established, is that going to change the treatment plan, or are things going to stay fairly similar, to what has been going on? And that's really going to vary from case to case. But I think, some other things that test results can do is that it allows people to connect to other individuals who have a similar diagnosis. And so I think of that being in the area of advocacy. And so, there's a number of support organizations, some that are larger, some that are smaller today, that sometimes can be specific to a particular neuromuscular disorder, as well as larger organizations like the Muscular Dystrophy Association that cover, multiple diagnoses. I'll talk to families about the possibility of considering to enroll in a disease registry, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But there's also, you also would have the opportunity, if one of exists, to determine if a clinical trial might be available for your specific diagnosis. A couple of, resources for that is the clinicaltrials.gov, which is through the National Institutes of Health. And now that the Muscular Dystrophy Association as well has placed a clinical trials finder tool within their website. So that helps to sort of filter out or sort out clinical trials that are specific to neuromuscular disorders. And often, those diagnosis-specific organizations can be very helpful for families or individuals trying to identify a disease registry, or also knowing if there's a clinical trial that's currently available or one that's anticipated in the near future. Next slide. Just a few additional thoughts about registries and why would somebody want to consider that. After someone's received a test result, I try to point out to them that if they're at home with their test results, aside from their clinic knowing, there's really no way to be found if there's a new treatment or discovery related to their specific medical diagnosis. Some common concerns that will come up about participating in a registry is, well, am I signing on for some specific kind of treatment down the road and I'm not even sure I want that? I try to remind people that participating in a registry does not commit them to a future treatment or therapy. It just usually is saying that they're open to being contacted. But registries also have other important roles. Many of the conditions that are supported by the MDA are individually, rather uncommon. And so there's still a lot of questions that we're trying to answer for families, such as, the natural history, what can we actually expect of the condition over time, and sometimes about the variability of that particular medical condition, which I think we're still continuing to learn about. Next slide. The next couple slides are trying to identify, and we do acknowledge that there are a number of different providers on the MDA team, and we can't highlight them all. But we thought particularly these three would be helpful to distinguish as part of today's webinar. So keeping in mind that the neurologist is the physician who diagnoses and treats the actual medical conditions within an MDA clinic. Genetic counselors are ones that would facilitate genetic testing based on the recommendations of the neurologist and address risks to other family members. The social worker in the clinic is knowledgeable and also identifies needs for different types of resources that might assist in the initial diagnosis or in the long-term treatment of one of the muscular dystrophies. Next slide. People will often ask after they receive their diagnosis, or sometimes even earlier on coming to clinic, how their medical diagnosis might affect other people in the family. And basically, as Dr. Malik had said earlier, if someone gets a positive genetic test result, it helps to confirm a diagnosis, but it also helps us to determine if other family members could be at risk for the same condition. It allows us to answer questions with regard to family planning. Could there be a child who could be at risk for the same medical condition, or another extended family member, for example? And then sometimes other family members, as we talked about earlier, can be used to help clarify genetic test results if someone's received results that have been unclear somehow. I do encourage families after they've received positive test results to be open to sharing those with other blood relatives. It's particularly important for a family member who may be experiencing similar symptoms. That can greatly shorten the time for that other family member to receive a diagnosis, particularly if it's suspected that they may have the same condition. And the genetic test results can help the physician of that other family member, know what particular gene or tests that they would need to be testing for in that particular family member. Next slide, please. We discussed a little bit earlier, about some of the ways that healthcare coverage is investigated before genetic testing is initiated. But again, how will genetic testing be covered? Many of the commercial genetic testing laboratories today have ways to do what's called a benefits investigation prior to the start of genetic testing. And that's essentially taking a look at the healthcare coverage, determining if a family or individuals met their deductible, for example. But that whole process reduces the chances of receiving an unexpected bill from testing. But it also allows us to look at other options if for some reason the estimated out-of-pocket expense for the individual is high, then we might need to take a look at other testing options for that person. Again, another thing I wanted to emphasize from today's webinar is decisions regarding genetic testing can be made outside of an actual clinic visit today. Some of the steps that were described, above in the slide can sometimes take some time, like for example, maybe doing a benefits investigation might take several days to a week to hear back from that laboratory. And so you may not have the results back from that immediately available to be able to make that decision right in the clinic. But again, each clinic site is different. Don't hesitate to ask, your other clinic, team members what the steps actually are for the genetic testing process in their clinic. Next slide. And what some people out there listening might want to know is, are there any no-cost options? And while there's not necessarily no-cost options for every category, there's an increasing number of no-cost programs, often created what we call partnership programs, where possibly a pharmaceutical company is partnered with a genetic testing laboratory in attempts to try to remove barriers for genetic testing. And so I'm highlighting 3 on this slide. The first one is one that's called the Lantern Project. This is a program that's sponsored through Sanofi Genzyme, and this testing performs one of those genetic testing panels that I discussed earlier of approximately 105 genes, including the gene for Pompe disease, as Dr. Malik talked about earlier. And that particular testing is actually performed at a genetics testing laboratory called PerkinElmer Genomics. As we've also highlighted spinal muscular atrophy as part of today's webinar, there's also a program called SMA Identified. This program is sponsored through Biogen, and it performs comprehensive testing for spinal muscular atrophy. And this testing is performed at a commercial laboratory which is called Invitae. And then finally, the last example is a program which is called Decode Duchenne. Now you might notice at the bottom of the slide it's performed at the same laboratory as the Lantern Project, PerkinElmer Genomics, but it's sponsored through a different company called Sarepta. And this is to allow genetic testing for Duchenne muscular dystrophy for affected males, and that their program is also expanded now to consider carrier testing for some females as well. Keep in mind the number of sponsored programs has continued to grow and change. I'd say that this has been a growing area, particularly in the last year or so. And so, again, these programs are put in place to help remove barriers for individuals to receive genetic testing. Next slide. So at the end of all of this, somebody's maybe gone through, someone's maybe listening today who's really gone through quite a bit of genetic testing in their lifetime, and they haven't received an answer. So someone might ask, am I at the end of all testing options? And the answer in most instances is no, they're not at the end. So one testing method that we've had available for several years now is a testing method that's able to look at all of the approximately 22,000 genes of the body with a single laboratory study. And it's known by a number of names, but one of the most common names is whole exome sequencing. Some people will even refer to it as WES. The one thing that has changed over the years that this testing has become available is that healthcare coverage is much more open to considering coverage for such testing like this today, whereas when it was first introduced, it was sometimes rather difficult to have that testing. Now there may be some individuals who are listening in who say, I've already had that testing too and I didn't receive an answer. And so the next line of testing after whole exome sequencing is essentially a more detailed version of that testing, which is able to look at some portions of the genetic instructions that aren't typically analyzed with genetic testing. And so that's called whole genome sequencing. And, the difficult part, even though that this is a method that's been available for a few years, is that there's still been some difficulty getting healthcare plans to recognize the testing and provide coverage, although that area is changing as well. The third area, and I believe the MDA has highlighted this project within the past several months, is a program which is called the Rare Genomes Project, and I provided the website there, and this is a project which is an option for individuals to be considered for whole genome sequencing who basically have had a multitude of genetic studies in the past with no definitive answer. Keep in mind, since I'm just listing these three, that we do anticipate testing options will continue to change as genetic technology improves. And again, this is the one area of medicine that with each sort of technological advance, the cost actually goes down as well. So I feel like something that was maybe quite difficult to get accomplished 10 years ago is becoming not so hard to accomplish in today's world. And with that slide, I think we'll be turning things over to our next speaker.
All right. Thank you, Richard. Now we will hear from Allison Miles. She's going to share her personal story of the value of genetic testing. Allison was diagnosed in 2018 with Pompe disease, and she has a really positive outlook on her future. And she's really turned her diagnosis into a platform to help others. So, Allison, go ahead and tell us your story.
Thanks, Nicole. So, in the world of Pompe, one of the questions we love to ask one another is, how did you get diagnosed? It's a great icebreaker because everybody has a story, and it's not uncommon for these stories to span the course of years and have some major twists and turns. For me, it took about 4 months from the time I walked into the neurologist's office for the very first time to when I received a phone call with my Pompe diagnosis. But it really started long before that. I could say it started 18 years ago when I donated blood and the report came back that I had elevated liver enzymes, which I now know is common with Pompe. But at the time, I saw a liver specialist for 15 years, and they could never find anything wrong with my liver. Or perhaps I could say it even started back when I was 9 months old and was diagnosed with a form of mild cerebral palsy after resisting bearing weight on my legs. I still today get mixed medical opinions on whether that was Pompe manifesting itself or if I truly hit the neuromuscular disease jackpot and had 2 separate diseases. But if I were to bring us back to present day and focus on what led me to going to the doctor in the first place, it was 2 specific things. The first was that I noticed things were getting pretty hard for me. Despite being only 33 years old, I felt like an old lady. Hikes on outdoor trails marked as easy felt to me like they were expert level. I couldn't do a proper squat after more than 100 Orange Theory fitness classes. Even picking up the laundry basket from the ground was hard. The second thing that I noticed was that the same types of things were hard for my sister too. I thought that was odd. She didn't have cerebral palsy. We couldn't both be so out of shape. It made me wonder if there was something else wrong with me, with both of us, something genetic. And we did ultimately both get diagnosed with Pompe disease in 2018. The 4 months from when I walked into that neurologist's office to getting the diagnosis were very challenging for me. The doctor was able to tell me from my very first visit that there was something wrong with me. Maybe muscular dystrophy, maybe polymyositis, she said. My next step was I got an EMG, which was a painful test which did confirm that I had, in fact, muscle damage. I then got one of those fun muscle biopsies that Rich mentioned, which was a surgical procedure that required me to take several days off work to recover. The muscle biopsy ruled out more common neuromuscular diseases, but still couldn't provide a conclusive diagnosis. And while those were both painful tests, the emotional and mental toil was worse. Not knowing what was wrong with me was worse than finding out. I felt like I needed an answer to make a plan on how to move forward with my life. I was stuck, and this missing piece of information was holding me back from planning for my future and enjoying my present. It impacted me so strongly that I'm almost positive I told the doctor, "That's great news," when I got that diagnosis of Pompe. I can only imagine that that's the first time a doctor has ever had that type of response when giving somebody a rare disease diagnosis. It was ultimately genetic testing that gave me that diagnosis I was looking for. Following the muscle biopsy, my neurologist transferred me to somebody who had more of a specialty in rare diseases, and he prescribed a genetic test. All I had to do was spit in the tube, and about 6 weeks later, I had my answer. I had that clarity on what was wrong with me and was able to mentally start moving forward with my life again. I was also very fortunate to receive a diagnosis for which there was treatment, and being on enzyme replacement therapy for just a year and a half has already substantially improved my quality of life. Pompe symptoms are very similar to other neuromuscular diseases, and it would have been very easy for me to continue to be misdiagnosed and to continue to be without treatment. So I'm very grateful for the thoroughness of the medical team caring for me and that they pushed to have me receive that genetic testing. Without it, I wouldn't be on treatment and I would be continuing to progress in the disease. I did want to close by saying, offering some encouragement for, anybody out there who may be, kind of going through that path of uncertainty or receiving a tough diagnosis. I would never wish these types of diseases on anybody, but there's so much to be grateful for, even with a diagnosis like Pompe. I really expected it to be a very lonely path, but even with a disease as rare as 1 in 40,000, I have found a great community of people who have turned into really close friends over a short period of time. I've had a bunch of new experiences, one of which is even starting a company selling non-slip socks, which is slipping has been an issue that I've struggled with. And being able to solve a challenge for myself, for other people, and donate funds back to, organizations like MDA to further research has been a way to really help bring some joy for me through the process. I've had other new experiences of, learning about an area I didn't know about, traveling to different conferences, and even more importantly, have had a chance to have a new perspective on what is and is not important in life. I think that's really a gift. So I'll close by saying, that even with a rare disease like Pompe, I would never say that I'm suffering from Pompe. I am living with Pompe, and I'm very much still enjoying my life. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Allison, for sharing your story. That was great to hear, and we definitely appreciate that. And thank you again, Dr. Malik and Richard, for a wealth of information. I would now like to open this webinar for any questions our audience may have. So if you will, remember, if you hover at the bottom of your screen, you can see the icons pop up on your screen, and if you just click on the chat bubble to open the chat feature, you can enter your questions to the host.
Nicole, while we're waiting for questions, can I just go ahead and ask Rich a question? Maybe I muted.
Dr. Malik, I think we might have lost Nicole's audio. So yes, please go ahead.
So one question that I frequently get from family members, Rich, is once they've received a genetic diagnosis, should all family members be should they undergo genetic testing? So how do you counsel those patients, especially if they have young children?
So a lot of it depends upon, let's say, to kind of break up that question, whether some of the other family members we're discussing have symptoms or not. So sort of one area to first touch upon is, let's say there's other family members with similar symptoms. Do each of those people need to have genetic testing? And we actually would say yes, just because each person should have their own set of genetic testing results, so that they would have all options open for things like registries, clinical trials, things like that. Sometimes for some of the other kinds of issues, let's say of determining testing to determine, let's say if someone might be a carrier of a particular neuromuscular condition, we certainly want to make sure that family members are aware that that's available, and sometimes each individual may have, sort of personal decisions about whether they would want to have testing or not, but you want to make sure that everyone knows that it's available and has an opportunity to review some of the reasons to consider testing.
Thank you very much. I think we lost Nicole, so this is Scott Wiebe with the MDA. I'll go ahead and serve as moderator here. There's a question that came in about if you could discuss sort of privacy issues and other considerations of online genetic testing forms available. They mentioned 23andMe, but there are other brands available. But that type of service, would you mind discussing the privacy issues and just other considerations with that?
Well, what I usually explain to families is the testing that the question has come up about, like 23andMe, Ancestry. It's an area that we call direct-to-consumer testing. And I always stress to people that the testing that's being offered in clinic is very different than that. So even though both testing methods involved maybe spitting into a tube, there's a whole different level in terms of privacy and things of that nature. The testing that's being offered in clinic is medical testing and is being sent to medical genetics laboratories, and that information is kept private. Now there are some ways that information is shared in a de-identified way in terms of, for example, genetic test results and assisting different laboratories being able to determine whether a genetic variation is truly related to a disease or not. But outside of that issue, again, very different testing in the medical testing where there is privacy involved.
And a follow-up question about the having the interpretation of the results and the differences between online available testing and testing that you've been talking about today. Could you talk just a little bit about that element of piece of it as well?
Yes. So the one thing that also differs with that is with the direct-to-consumer testing, that individual is able to access their test results immediately themselves without the go-between of a medical provider. That is not the case with the testing that's done through a clinic where usually the results are released to the physician who had ordered the testing, first, and then that information is communicated to the family. And the reasons for doing that there's a number of reasons, but hopefully today's webinar has illustrated, that there's sometimes unclear results, and it's helpful to have somebody interpret the results in context with their physical findings and their other test results to see, could this be an answer to their diagnosis or possibly not.
Absolutely. Thank you for that added point. There's a question, we used SMA and Pompe as examples today, but there's a question of if there is a genetic panel test available for CMT.
This is Dr. Malik. Yes, absolutely there is. And in fact, there is a free genetic panel that's available, which is a comprehensive panel that checks for multiple genes associated with CMT or hereditary neuropathy.
Thank you. And I'm going to attempt to paraphrase this question, but if there's a mutation that's been found in genetic testing that has been shown to lead to certain conditions but isn't directly linked to it, do you have guidance for families that are dealing with that sort of uncertain situation?
And we're trying to, I guess, kind of clear. It sounds like that family or that individual might have received one of those, what we talked about, variants of uncertain significance, where there was a finding, but maybe not entirely clear whether it's related to, a medical diagnosis or not. In those instances, we definitely encourage families to stay in touch with their clinics, because some of the genetic changes end up being reclassified over time. So sometimes, even though they may not have a clear understanding of the results in one year, possibly the year following or after, they have more information and they may be able to tell that family more.
Wonderful, thank you. You mentioned genetic testing changing over time, the types of tests of being available changing over time. There's a question that if I believe what it's getting at is that they found that Duchenne muscular dystrophy when he was 4 years old, and the question is would the diagnosis coming from genetic testing possibly change with new and different testing available now?
Generally, no. Again, sometimes don't know all the specifics on the question. Sometimes for example, it might not change the specific diagnosis, but maybe more would be known about that specific genetic change, for example, about being amenable to certain treatments, for example, or another purpose of registries as they're trying to track, are there certain genetic changes, like say in Duchenne, that maybe are at risk for certain health complications, maybe more at risk, say, for cardiac heart complications than other people. So that's an example where maybe the test results themselves don't change, but our understanding of the results improves over time.
Very good, thank you. A great question here. How do I find a genetic counselor in my area?
So one resource that should work for most people is you can go to the National Society of Genetic Counselors, also known as the NSGC, and on their website they have a genetic counselor finder that would be able to find somebody in your geographical area. I do sort of speak that there can be some benefit, and it does vary in different parts of the country, if you could work with a genetic counselor that has some experience in either in neurology or neuromuscular disorders, but that also may not always be possible depending on where you live.
Understandable. And we just have a couple minutes left, but one person, first of all, thanks us for the webinar, so thank you to our panel. And they mentioned that they have limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, and they have a 3-year-old boy who has not had any genetic testing done, and they were curious of, they might need to follow up with their doctor specifically, but if you have any input on suggestions of genetic testing for their children, people's children.
My recommendation is always that if a child is not showing any symptoms, that genetic testing be delayed. So if they have no medical problems and perfectly healthy child, then it's probably best to not perform genetic testing at that stage. Rich, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I'd say I'd feel the same. I think the only thing that would maybe change, say, in the future is, let's say there was a medical condition in the family where there had been a specific treatment that was developed where we knew if we started that early, let's say even before symptoms, but that usually doesn't apply to, many of the conditions that we've been discussing today.
And there are a handful of questions coming in about the Allison mentioned something that she had developed that was helping her in a company she had started, and I think there was some confusion on people asking if it was for flipping, but it was. She has shared that she developed a new style of non-slip socks that have helped her avoid slipping. Was the point there, to clarify. And just one last question here, if I can, before we do need to wrap up. Just if you have any sort of final points about finding, there's a number of questions about finding genetic counselors and finding genetic testing in their area. Obviously, you mentioned the National Society of Genetic Counselors and also contacting their local MDA clinic to identify any possibilities there. But if you had any other final comments or overarching points, we'd love to hear them.
I'm just going to go back to my first couple of points that I made before starting the webinar. I hope you learned today that genetic testing is easy to perform, right? So we talked about samples that can be taken just by spitting into a tube or a cheek swab. And it can definitely expedite diagnosis in a number of situations, so you don't have to go through other multiple steps, which may be expensive, in some cases uncomfortable and painful, and it leads to a definite diagnosis. And in some cases, early diagnosis can lead to early initiation of treatment, which in turn can affect the prognosis of the disease.
Okay, and that will conclude our webinar. We are right up at 2 o'clock. And I just wanted to thank our guest presenters today, Dr. Rabia Malik, Richard Nee, and Allison Miles. We sincerely appreciate your time and expertise and everything you do for our neuromuscular community. I also wanted to thank again our event sponsor, Sanofi Genzyme. We wouldn't be able to provide events like this if not for their generous support, so thank you very much. If anyone does have questions after this webinar, or if we have not gotten to your questions, please feel free to email them to mdaengage@mdausa.org, and we will follow back up with you. This concludes the MDA Engage Genetic Testing webinar. Thank you very much for attending. Goodbye.